am not.
Okay.
So welcome everybody. In mine and also in Ben's name, I am taking over his part. I'm very grateful that he has made it possible for us to start in time, even though he should actually be with his dentist. So that is why I will talk a little bit more and he will talk a little bit less today. I'm really pleased that we are able to resume our lecture series, which started for the first time in May 2021. And it's one of the positive outcomes of the pandemic that has brought many Seleukid scholars or just students and colleagues interested in the Seleukids. Well, that has brought us together. So Seleukid Wednesday has become established now all across the world, which is great. Before I introduce our speakers for today, I'd like to make one announcement. There will be a great conference on the Seleukids in Athens in October. Crise, effondrement et redressement de l'autorité séleucide. And the English title will be Crisis, Collapse, and the Recovery of Royal Authority, hosted by the École Française d'Athènes as a hybrid event from the 19th to the 21st of October, a Wednesday to Friday event. The program has mainly been organized by the Nancy Seleukid Study Group, and the contact person is Laetitia Grasselin-Thomé, who is also with us. And I put some further information, including Laetitia's email address for further questions, but also the website the page, which will soon include the conference website, into the chat box. So you'll find all the information there. Now, today's speaker will be Miss Deirdre Klokow. She received her BA in Classics at Columbia University, where she was introduced to Hellenistic studies by Professor John Ma. She's currently a PhD candidate at the University of Southern California, where she's working on a PhD under the supervision of Dr. Christelle Fischer-Beauvais, who is also with us today. She is expecting to defend her PhD in late spring 2023. And the main topic is the social and economic history of the Seleukid Empire, focused on the interaction between the Seleukids and local or regional communities. Other interests in the Seleukids include Seleukid royal women, and she is currently working on some studies on Laodike III and Cleopatra Thea. Well, all these research interests in the Seleukids have already been, well, displayed to us in her first talk in this lecture series last June, which was also on female agency and the interaction between the royal court and the locals involving spatial and economic aspects. Deirdre could already show her expertise a year ago. And well, we have been so pleased by working together with Deirdre ever since that she has also been appointed the assistant editor of the new series, Seleukid Perspectives, the first volume of which Ben and I hope will appear early next year. So now, well, not now, in 2 minutes, we will be looking forward to listening to her talk, Local Economies and the Evidence of Bronze Coinage in the Seleukid Empire. Before we go there, I'd also like to introduce our expert who will give feedback. This is Dr. Kyle Erickson. Actually, no need to introduce him again. He has had an active role in this series and also in the Seleukid study group since its inception, but still a few words. I always love to, there is Kyle, yes. I always love to pronounce his current title, Director of Academic Experience, which sounds so great. Previously, he was the chair or the head of Department of Classical Studies at the University Trinity St. David in Lampeter, Wales, United Kingdom. And well, he is devoted to Seleukid topics since his PhD studies from 2006 to 2010 at the University of Exeter. And I only mentioned the three main fruits that have sprung from these endeavors so far, three Seleukid books. The latest published in 2019, The Early Seleucids, Their Gods and Their Coins. In 2018, The Seleukid Empire, 281 to 222 BC, War Within the Family. And in 2011, co-edited with Gillian Ramsey, Seleucid Dissolution, The Sinking of the Anchor. So we look very much forward to listening to your feedback, Kyle, in about 45 minutes. Beforehand, we are now very pleased and excited to hear Deirdre talk to us.
Sorry, I just got a pop-up. Thank you for that, Altay. I'm very happy to be here. Can I share my screen?
You should be able to do so. If you see that it's not happening, I make you co-host.
Yes.
No, I can't do that. Can you do that? Ben, can you make Deirdre co-host?
Yes, tell me how. Hold on.
Same as you did with me.
I'm gonna make her, I think I did it. I think I did it.
Can you try again,
I
Deirdre?
see that I am the co-host, so I should be able to make it happen.
It works.
Great. Great. Okay. Thank you for that introduction, Altay. Before I get started, I just want to extend my thanks to Altay and Ben for their kindness in having me back to speak at this lecture series. Support like this for graduate students especially is really important and very encouraging in the sort of tough slog that a dissertation can be. So I'm really grateful. I also want to thank everyone for coming along here on this Seleukid Wednesday, and to thank Kyle Erickson for agreeing to act as respondent today. Really looking forward to hearing what he has to say. I also want to acknowledge my advisor, Christelle Fisher-Beauvais, who's here with us, just for her constant support and patience and hard work, without which I would be in very serious trouble. So thank you. Lastly, I also want to say that I am having a little bit still the after effects of my most recent bout with COVID. So hopefully my voice will last through this entire talk, fingers crossed. Okay, my discussion today presents the genesis of the dissertation chapter that deals with economic functions and social contexts of Seleukid small change, particularly the bronze issues. As such, today's paper is not intended in any way to be a comprehensive discussion of Seleukid bronzes, but more of a way in, possibly to a mode of thought for these coins and the local networks of which they are representative. So the poet Cavafy tells us that he's ridiculous, the Seleukid, with his vulgar luxury, encapsulating a long common trend towards the wealth and display of Seleukid kings, their elite world of opulence extracted from the resources and the peoples of their diverse empire. Without adopting Cavafy's carefully expressed disdain, much social and economic scholarship on the Seleucids has still remained focused on this level of elite royal interaction. The excellent works of Laurent Capdetré, Paul Cosman, and Garas Apergis have each emphasized the unity and even the centralization of the Seleukid economic ideologies, which allowed this foreign colonial power to create and retain stability within its acquired realm. It is necessary, however, to counter the emphasis on imperial cohesion with the concerns and circumstances of local actors. Seleukid success, I argue, rested in no small part on their ability to invest in and preserve local power structures carefully balancing regional needs against stability for the whole. It is when this balance fails that Seleukid power begins to crumble, helped along always, of course, by a healthy dose of dynastic infighting. The study of Seleukid numismatics, which embraces expressions of both the local and the imperial, autonomy and subjugation, provides us with a helpful example in considering how the Seleukids attempted to complete this balance. On to Seleukid bronzes in particular. Coinage within the Seleukid kingdom can be roughly grouped into 3 types. Royal coinage, which was struck in both precious metal and bronze at different mints throughout the kingdom, and which were struck with official imperial typologies. There is the autonomous bronze coinage, the striking of which is generally understood as a privilege awarded to certain cities or populations by the Seleukid king, and which were intended for local distribution and used local references in their names and types. And we have the quasi or semi-municipal coins, struck mostly in bronze, but occasionally in silver, which I will discuss in a little bit. I argue that the minting and use of civic and quasi-municipal bronzes were not only a long-standing element of the Seleukid economic system, but a necessary function of the smaller microeconomic regions of which the kingdom was composed. The Seleukid production model, as reconstructed by Houghton and Lorber, suggests a major mint within each satrapy to the empire's east, with multiple mints in the western regions dominated by the Greek polis system, where there was a more heavily monetized economy already in place, such as in Asia Minor and Cilicia. Despite their open economic system, which allowed the circulation of any adequate coins within the borders of the Seleukid territory, I've chosen here to focus particularly only on coins struck within or by the Seleukid kingdom, and emphasize particularly production in the empire's western regions. The production of bronze coinage began quite early in the Seleukid period and increased rapidly to meet the expanding demand, often tied to periods of war and the presence of soldiers. The western regions of the empire in particular witnessed a large increase in the production of bronze during the 3rd century. This is particularly true at the cities of Sardis and Antioch on the Orontes, which are both dominant centers of their respective regions. From the west, production of bronzes expanded into the east, with multiple smaller mints across the imperial territory producing bronzes exclusively, although usually on a fairly limited scale and for a short time period, most likely in response to certain specific local circumstances. The presence of military iconography, such as horses and elephants on bronze types, indicate that their production was likely intended for the presence of the Seleukid army and meant for use by soldiers and mercenaries. It's been clearly demonstrated, largely by Kathy Lorber, that bronze production in Coile Syria was intended for use by the army during the campaigns of the 5th Syrian War. During the 3rd century, there seems to have been a shift and an increase in the minting of Seleukid bronzes. The production of bronzes come to something of a stop in Asia Minor by the end of the 3rd century, but in the Syrian Seleucus, the tetropolis city of Antioch began issuing an increased volume of bronze coins, both larger new issues and a very low denomination depicting Apollo on both the obverse and the reverse. These new issues differ from earlier bronze types, which generally carried local imagery and remained in circulation only within the sphere of their city of origin. Antioch's new small bronzes, they're about 1¼ to 1½ grams in weight, display dynastic types and seem to have been intended for regional use. They display a wide circulation pattern, more moving through northern Syria and into the cities of the east to Antioch, Seleucia and Pera, Duriopus, and Susa. These new bronzes evolved slowly into a regional currency, seemingly intended to function for low-level transaction and exchanges within Syria, with the mint at Antioch serving as a new regional center for bronze production under its Seleucus IV, Antiochus IV, and their successors into the early 1st century, when the production of these bronzes ended in about 93 BCE, to be replaced by a completely new civic coinage. In the southwest of the empire, the cities of Ptolemais and Damascus became the major producers of bronze coinage for Coile-Syria. Ptolemais from the time of Antiochus III through Antiochus VIII, and Damascus from the reign of Antiochus VII into the early 1st century. In Phoenicia, under Antiochus III, the city of Tyre minted bronzes for regional use, continuing to increase its output during the reign of Demetrius I until 125 BCE. Following Antiochus III's conquest of the region, the mint of Ptolemais stopped its production of the silver tetradrachms it had been producing for Ptolemy V, and turned instead to a high output of bronzes of the same type and denomination as those currently being minted at Antioch. The post-conquest period ushered in a time of numismatic innovation. Seleukid IV introduced a high denomination bronze struck in a new fabric. Under Antiochus IV, a bronze mint was established at Seleucia Imperia, issuing a single small denomination coinage intended for low-level exchange in northern Syria and the newly conquered regions of the south, along with the mints of Antioch and Ptolemais. Around 168, or closely thereafter, Antioch began producing multi-denominational bronzes with the so-called Egyptianizing type. And around the same time, we have the first appearance of the quasi-municipal coinages. Farther still to the east, the cities of Seleucia on the Tigris, Susa, and Ecbatana all continued to produce bronzes until the collapse of Seleukid authority in the region. Seleucia on the Tigris kept up a prolific output of different bronze denominations well into the short-lived reign of Antiochus VII. Bronze coinage, of course, was a fiduciary or a token coinage with a face value that greatly exceeds its actual intrinsic value. It served in the West as an accepted medium for exchange, but its introduction into the East seems to have possibly been met with a little bit of a level of distrust, which is recorded by the authors of the Babylonian astronomical diaries for 273 in the context of a description of preparations undertaken by the Seleucids for the First Syrian War. And we have here lines 30 to 31 describing the requisitioning of much silver, cloth, goods, and utensils from both Babylon and Seleucia on the Tigris, as well as the dispatching of 20 Bactrian elephants to the royal army in Syria. This segment of the astronomical diaries has often been understood, for example, by Bert van der Spek, as signifying a scarcity of silver in Babylonia, which resulted in the use of the Greek bronze coins for purchase, as the text refers to them, the copper coins of Ionia. Gruber's thorough price analysis in Babylonia has shown, however, that there exists no evidence for a scarcity of silver to trigger the necessity for bronze coinage in this period. In fact, as we've seen, bronze coinage was struck in Seleucia on the Tigris from the very early years of the dynasty under Seleucus I. Nearly all of the bronze coins that were discovered at the city of Uruk in southern Babylonia were minted at the workshop of Seleucia on the Tigris during the 3rd century or the first half of the 2nd century BC. Given the evidence for the circulation of bronzes from Seleucia into southern Babylonia, it is likely that the much closer city of Babylon, which lacked its own mint after 293, would have received and been familiar with the use of bronze issues from Seleucia on the Tigris. Rather than reflecting a change in the nature of monetary transactions, therefore, the reference to the copper coins of Ionia in the diaries likely reflects a new increase in the use of and demand for bronze coinage for local exchange within the city of Babylon itself. This is possibly more a result of the increased presence of soldiers around about the city who are likely to have been using bronze denominations from their own pay to pay for goods, than signifying a change brought on by the royal requisition of silver and enforced by Seleukid authority. Rather than being intended to create a monetized economy, the evidence from the excavations in Thrace, for example, of many bronzes from Sardis of Antiochus II demonstrate the predominantly military function of Seleukid coinage and its use to finance the expansion of their empire, using internal mints to provide the fiscal resources for faraway campaigns. A similar conclusion can be drawn from the Parthian campaign of Seleucus II, which drew contributions of bronze money and of silver from the cities of Nisibis, Susa, Ecbatana, and other unidentified mints in Mesopotamia and the East. It seems to have only been soldiers and the requirements of long-term campaigns which could cause coinage to transcend its original local microregion. Sorry, my voice is on the fritz. A focus on these microregions, particularly in terms of their economic and cultural behaviors, may help to orient our perspectives on the relationship between imperial power and local or regional economic behaviors. Despite a tendency in modern scholarship on the Seleukid economy to treat it as a more or less rationalized, even standardized entity in the guise of more modern centralized states, numerous different systems of language, of cultural expression, and of means of exchange continued to coexist under Seleukid dominion. Local bronze issues circulated together with the centrally produced precious metal coinages, and with coins of altogether different issuing authorities due to the open monetary system the Seleucids encouraged. As I will discuss in a bit, coins with bilingual inscriptions circulated in some regions, demonstrating a need to create coinage capable of functioning within a non-standardized system of payment and exchange. The issuing of official coinage with its carefully standardized royal portraits and inscriptions may be taken to represent only a thin facade of imperial domination that overlapped with local and regional politics capable of impacting trade and exchange within the empire. Focusing not simply on the bronze coins themselves, but on this overlapping or interaction may sharpen our comprehension of local patterns of consumption and modes of expression. Local actors display a willingness to orient their behavior to the presence of overarching imperial domination rather than attempt to fully break from its molds. After all, while empires rise and fall and rise again, local communities, which are embedded closely in the land and have a deep historical memory, tend to endure. On to the quasi-municipal coinage. During the reign of Antiochus III, the Phoenician city of Tyre began to produce a bronze coinage bearing the usual portrait and name of the Seleukid king on the obverse, which is standard, with locally significant symbols in place of the usual Seleukid dynastic emblem. Naval imagery, date palms, and a club referring to the god Melkart, which is a god often also recognized as Heracles, as we see on the slides here. Under the next king, Seleucus IV, those Tyrian coinages continued. This use of bronze coinages to express local civic identities proliferated under Antiochus IV. Quite a few cities and dynastic refoundations in the West now adopted coin types that drew deliberate attention to their historic pre-Seleukid religious and cultural identities, the so-called quasi-municipal coinages, which are understood as being intended for local circulation. In Cilicia, Antioch on the Kidness and the refounded city of Tarsus issued coins with the image of the god Sandan and his altar. Coinage from Antioch on the Kidness displays the god standing over a horned winged lion in an explicitly Neo-Hittite fashion. It's an almost deliberately non-Greek image. The images of pre-conquest gods from the Levant feature on the reverses of coins from Byblos and the ancient city of Berytus, refounded by the Seleucids as Laodicea in Phoenicia. In Syria, coins from Damascus, the refounded city of Demetrius, display images of the gods Atargatis and Hadad on their reverses. The reverse images on the quasi-autonomous coinages are not always such a stark expression of identity. Some cities, such as Hierapolis and Acatolemias, displayed a more standard image of Zeus or the eagle. The use of more widely recognizable imagery by these cities may possibly reflect an economic imperative. Acatolemias was a relatively recent foundation and had just been under Ptolemaic control. The eagle, a well-known Ptolemaic symbol, would have helped to express the legitimacy of the coin and to encourage its acceptance in the region. It's been suggested that the eagle may be intended to represent a ruler cult for Antiochus IV, reflecting that king's association with Zeus. I think a more likely explanation is that Achaemenid, lacking the kind of deep civic heritage of the more ancient Phoenician cities, chose the symbol sort of pragmatically in order to facilitate trade in a region where Ptolemaic imagery had long been current, reflecting both local and imperial connotations. It's not only, so this is the reverse from Ptolemy's Ake. It is not only in imagery that we find an explicit expression of non-Seleucid identity. With the exception of Tripolis, the Phoenician cities used their own Phoenician alphabet for inscriptions on the reverse of their coins. Often these are bilingual inscriptions. The public use of this pre-conquest alphabet is a clear expression of a historical identity separate from Seleucid identity, although existing in tandem with it, as the coins share space with the Greek inscription as well. The reverses of the quasi-municipal coins from Laodicea and Phoenicia display the legend of or belonging to Laodicea, mother of Canaan. Sidon referred to itself as the mother of Cambe, Hippone, Hittium, and Tyre, while the city of Tyre presented its quasi-municipal coinage with the legend of Tyre, mother of the Sidonians. Finally, during the reign of Alexander II Sabinus, a short-lived series of quasi-municipal coins minted by the Seleukid refoundation, Laodicea in Phoenicia, blazoned its earlier pre-conquest name, referring to its coinages of or belonging to Berytus, the mother of Canaan. Since we know that most Seleukid refoundations abandoned their dynastic names with the cessation of Seleukid control, the use of the indigenous name Berytus suggests a straining at the leash of imperial control, if not an outright bid for Seleukid autonomy. In all of these cases, the expression of civic identity takes the form of a denial, or at least an avoidance of the imperially imposed dynastic name, an expression of agency that lasted only as long as, for instance, Sabinus himself did, after which the dynastic name is restored. These expressions of civic status are clearly intended for a local regional audience, rather than expressing official recognition of status from the Seleucids, which might have implied recognition on an imperial level. The imagery and legends of these coins should be understood not simply as a meeting point between individual self-representation and the imposition of Seleucid iconography, but as an imperially controlled method of articulating local identity, a place where the jockeying for position between cities such as Tyre and Sidon could be safely expressed under the aegis of Seleukid authority. Quasi-autonomous coinage from the point of view of the Seleucids contains civic expressions of autonomy by turning them into a horizontal, that is, a city-to-city form of competition, rather than one that might be directed upwards towards kings and elites. Regionally disparate as some of these examples are, the coinages nevertheless partake of a shared network of dialogue with Seleukid imperial power. The cultural expressions on their reverses are clearly aimed at a wider than local audience. After all, what is the use of proclaiming yourself the mother of the Sidonians if the Sidonians are never actually going to hear about it? The language of intercity competition only makes sense if there is some level of economic interpenetration that would allow these dueling claims of regional superiority to meet and interact. The issue of Phoenicia and Coile Syria is, however, always something of a special case for the Seleucids. Finally incorporated into their realm by Antiochus III following the 5th Syrian War, after a century or so of Ptolemaic control of the region, it's clear today that these regions were treated with a light hand by Antiochus, who was undoubtedly hesitant to force full integration of these long-sought territories into his empire, lest he cause political and economic upheaval at what might be called a rather delicate time, resulting in a gradual integration marked by a carefully controlled balance of power between the Seleucids themselves and the cities of the Levant. The sea power of the Phoenician cities had enabled them to claim a certain level of autonomy from the Achaemenids, such as the right to be governed by their own native kings. A similar situation seems to have obtained under the Seleucids, who similarly lacked strong naval capabilities. While this relationship was unique, it allows us a glimpse into the ability of Seleukid kings to encourage, facilitate, and control local expressions of autonomy as a tool to encourage political and perhaps economic stability. Nevertheless, the appearance of the royal portrait and inscriptions on the obverse of these semi-autonomous coins contextualize the expressions of independent civic identities within a larger statement of imperial dominance, which effectively denied the statements of cultural autonomy expressed on the reverses of these coins. Paradoxically, autonomy exists only under the aegis of the Seleukid king. Still, as Oliver Hoover has recently shown, when Ptolemaic power was again ascendant in the region following the reign of Alexander I Balas, the quasi-municipal coinage issued in Phoenicia depicted the Seleukid king stripped of his radiate crown and his epithets, without all the sort of trappings of divinity, demonstrating that the manipulation of political imagery was a two-way street. It was, however, not only the ancient Phoenician cities with their long civic heritage that displayed their local identities on their coinage. Seleucia and Pieria placed a thunderbolt on the reverses of their coins in reference likely to their local cult of Zeus Chronios. Laodicea by the Sea displayed naval imagery, dolphins, those are some of my favorites, I love the dolphins, and also an image of Poseidon, and Apamea and the Axios depicted a panther and a thyrsus in reference to its cult of Dionysus, and armor in reference likely to its function as a military colony. Although archaeology has demonstrated that these Seleukid colonies of northern Syria were newly created urban centers without a pre-Seleukid past, these Seleukid dynastic centers constructed on these coins a claim to a rooted local identity that extended beyond the Seleukid. Municipal coinages do not seem to have passed into the east of the empire. Seleucia on the Tigris, Antioch on the Erythraean Sea, and Susa each minted only royal bronze coinages. It's possible that Antiochus IV saw no reason to encourage expressions of regional autonomy in an area distant from the empire's recent area of focus in the West. The issue of geography is also, I think, relevant here. The landscape of the Eastern Empire does not quite reflect the tightly packed urban density of Syria and the Levant. By the time of Antiochus IV, of course, the Seleucids had already seen the loss of Bactria and could have little reason to want to encourage further displays of independence. Additionally, it's possible that the high military presence in the region might have necessitated the production of royal bronzes as pay for soldiers. Bronzes were often used to pay provision money to soldiers, likely those stationed in the region on garrison duty. This provision pay would have been then used in local markets for small purchases, daily needs likely, and would have thus remained in local circulation with a limited long distance circulation so long as soldiers and garrisons remained in residence in the region. Payment in royal coinage might have helped to stabilize relations between the king and his troops, while also minimizing the risk of disruption by allowing soldiers to pay for purchases in an easily recognizable and readily acceptable coinage. It's likely that this use would have increased to a certain degree the monetization of the Seleukid economy in the East, where fiduciary coinage was not normally used. But there is no reason to believe that such monetization was a deliberate Seleukid policy. It's likely that rural economies remain for the most part outside of the monetary economy present in the cities, and there's no evidence for any attempt on the part of the Seleucids to change that. Nevertheless, the more urbanized economy and the commodity-based economy of the more rural areas certainly did exist in tandem. From George the Writer, we have this idea that each city functioned essentially as its own closed currency system, which is an idea that has proved quite enduring when it comes to understanding the function and circulation of bronzes, despite the fact that it has not been quite definitively proven. And this may reflect a tendency to think about ancient monetary systems, much as we think about our own today, as sort of closed national systems. The question remains whether bronze coinages were so overvalued that they could really only circulate within the sphere of their issuing authority, or whether they might have found acceptance on a wider sphere. There is some evidence for bronze coinages and small change circulating in regions that are not of their origin, which would suggest that it is at least possible for bronzes to attain a kind of wider circulation. If they do not generally do so, that is, if they do not generally circulate more widely, we must look to patterns of trade and exchange to understand the role played by bronzes in both intra and inter-regional trade. The question of why municipal coinages were minted at all remains a very complicated one. Traditionally, it was assumed that the introduction of these coinages stemmed from the weakness of the king and was seen as evidence of imperial decline. As I mentioned previously, however, royal and autonomous coinages were sometimes produced simultaneously at the same mint, so unlikely. Another possible theory suggests that municipal coinages were representative of attempts by Antiochus IV to bolster good relations between the crown and the cities of the empire. I tend to think an economic explanation is the most likely, allowing cities to share in the profit of minting, particularly in the cases of bronzes, which came with a very high minting profit, strengthen the economic basis of the cities at a time when the Seleucids were possibly saddled with the cost of the indemnities owed to Rome following the defeat of Antiochus III, although the extent of this Roman debt is now much debated. The quasi-municipal coinages were not the only monetary innovations of the successors of Antiochus III. Higher denomination bronzes were struck under Seleucus IV in a new serrae fabric in the west, and it seems they were sent in large quantities into Coile, Syria, and the south. The introduction of these coins remains something of an enigma. They're struck on a serrated flan, often referred to as bottle cap coins in reference to their jagged or saw-like edges. Obviously, they look very much like bottle caps, and often displaying this like divot in their center. They required extra effort and attention in their fabrication, which is kind of unusual given the low value of the coins themselves. It seems likely that the introduction of these bronzes represents an attempt to regulate and control the coinage used for low-level transactions in Syria and the Levant, although more research is certainly needed. Although I will say that my colleague, Eduardo Garcia Molina, who's here today, has, I think, a paper forthcoming and a lecture forthcoming as well at the ANS, I think, at the American Numismatic Society in November, I think, on these serrate bronzes. So maybe we'll find out everything we need to know then. And maybe he'll talk a little bit more about that today. Circulation patterns for bronze coinages, for all coinages, really, which are only very sketchily understood, suggest that the quasi-municipal bronzes, excepting those from Tyre, did not travel very far from their city of issue. As I mentioned previously, it's sometimes suggested that the appearance of these coins under Antiochus IV is to be related to his attempt to promote civic life, but such a policy is rendered unlikely by their limited appearance in select cities of the West and Mesopotamia. Such coinages are often considered struck perhaps to honor the arrival of the king in the manner of the Roman Adventus issues. Their northern progression in their appearance only in single years might certainly follow the path of a royal visit. But again, their limited geographical range seems to make this interpretation somewhat unlikely. I suggest that the quasi-municipal coinages are better interpreted according to their twinned regional, economic, and ideological function. Recent studies by Panos Yosef have shown that most of the bronze coins found in archaeological excavations, I think there's around 7,000, come from Syria and the Levant, and that the great majority of them, something close to 6,000, remained at or near those regions. Similar results were found in Mesopotamia and Media, where something like 85% of the bronzes minted there remain within those regions. Although, as Yosef admits in his study, a much smaller sample size here makes larger conclusions difficult to draw. As always, the further we go east, the harder the evidence makes it for us to come to clearer conclusions. Of course, the geographical dispersion of bronze coins, should be low is not unexpected, as they represent small denominations meant for everyday local transactions, and local types may have possibly made them less welcome outside of the realm of their issuing city than the royal types, such as on the Seleukid silver tetradrachms. Originally, the practical difficulties involved in carrying enough bronze coins for use in long distance trade would have made high value silver the more likely option. You would really need a very large sack of bronze coins for any kind of viable trading venture. I don't know how likely anyone would have been to be sort of carrying this around with them. Still, in Syria and the Levant, some 67% of tetradrachms remained in the region of their issuing, while in Mesopotamia and Media, a larger portion actually leave from their place of origin, which is likely to reflect the mobility of soldiers moving around from place to place and taking with them their pay. Within a year of their being struck, something close to 90% of bronze coins are remaining in the province of their original minting, versus something in the realm of 75% of silver coins. While the higher percentage of silver coins leaving their region of origin does suggest, as Joseph and his collaborators have suggested, that silver was a more likely form of interregional payment, the high likelihood that both bronze and silver issues would remain in the region where they're struck suggests that neither the high value silver issues nor the low value bronzes were commonly used for transactions beyond the local, in the case of bronzes, and administrative and royal payments for the silver. Most financial needs seem to have been met with coinage produced in that region itself, with coins moving only slowly and rarely across regional boundaries. This, together with the lack of mid-value coinage between the extremely high-value silver and the small, low-value bronze denominations, suggests that the Seleukid monetary economy was structured around smaller microeconomic regions clustered around local and regional sites. Okay, my voice is holding out. We are drawing to a conclusion. It is not simply patterns of circulation which speak to a fragmented micro-regional economic structure. The use of control marks under the Seleukid can tell us a similar story. The use of control systems relying on the use of monograms, thought to be abbreviations of personal names, likely those of the mint official himself, is usually understood as a system internal to the mint, identifying those responsible for coin production as a means of guarding against corruption or misconduct. But some Seleukid controls may be intended to serve a more administrative function by identifying the official who ordered the coinage to be struck, suggesting that the decentralized economic model of the Seleukid kingdom may have necessitated an additional level of guarantee for the legal status of a coinage to be accepted. This could reflect more largely on the flexible hierarchical nature of the Seleukid government and the tendency for regions under their control to exhibit varying degrees of submission to royal authority, necessitating multiple levels of control marks on Seleukid authority to convey its legitimacy. Taken all in all, the wide production of Seleukid bronzes suggests their very real importance to the functioning of local and regional economies. Unlike silver money, bronze coins remained in use for a very long time, perhaps as long as 100 years after they were first struck, making their continued output at Seleukid regional centers throughout the period of Seleukid control a significant economic factor. There can be little doubt that the issuing of civic bronze coinages generated a fairly significant revenue for issuing cities, but there is likewise little doubt that the bronzes met a real economic need, as well as serving as a significant tool for localized ideological expression. The decentralized model of Seleukid rule, constructed not around a single dominant urban center, but around rather multiple regional centers, such as Seleukid on the Tigris and Antioch on the Orontes, possibly Iconium in the east, promoted a more dispersed form of regional development, which bound together small cities with their agricultural hinterlands into a regional framework of trade, exchange, and communication. While this kind of framework may imply, as Siddha von Rieden has recently suggested, an economic structure that is less strongly integrated on a vertical hierarchical scale towards kings and elites, I argue that it nevertheless promoted a stronger sense of regional engagement at the local and civic level. further examination of local coinages within both their ideological and their fiscal contexts will help to refocus our attention away from the role of kings and elites to emphasize the manner in which economic practices at the imperial level interact and intersect with local communities and opportunities. Thank you. My voice had out the whole time.
Thank you very much for this really thought-provoking presentation. But first of all, kudos for the physical performance you have given here, that you went into the pains and but you delivered very well. I hold back from further comments and immediately pass on the floor to Kyle for his expert feedback.
I'm going to second. Thank you for that incredible paper and also managing to get through it post-COVID. My recovery was slower than yours, I think. Also, thank you, Altay and Ben, for organizing and hosting this again. I will attempt to do that paper justice because I think you've raised a number of really interesting and interconnected arguments that I think fundamentally question some of the assumptions we've made about both the Seleukid economy, but also how the empire might function. And some of that is key to the notion is that you've explored how heavily regional the Seleukid empire is in relation to the circulation of coinage. And actually, I think both Joseph and yourself have possibly underplayed how regional silver coinage as well might be. And the ramifications for that, I think, might be significant. And I'll come back to raising some of those questions again later. But I think you've raised serious questions as well to the sort of long-standing notion that bronze coinage is local. And I think there's probably an important distinction to draw between regional and local. And if you think of coinage, and I think you said it well with Tyre claiming to be the mother of the Sidonians, it can't be coinage that is only designed to circulate within Sidon if its insult is directed at the Tyrians and the Tyrians likewise. And I think that regional nature of the Seleukid Empire is an important factor more broadly. And so that's essential in considering how those regional differences might pick up on the movement to coinage away from the region of origin. And I think you suggested, probably rightly, that this is likely tied to military movements if most of the coinage is in the first place, or if the first consumers of the coinage are military. And this may both suggest some micro-regionality in the distribution of the Seleukid army, and the movement of soldiers across the empire at any one given time. So one question here that I wanted to raise is how much of this portrayal of the empire with a series of sort of regional hubs with wider economic outputs is not just representative of the Seleukid Empire, but more representative of either Near Eastern empires or ancient economies more generally, and how that ties into that structure of what the Seleucids are doing. Are they, and I think you suggested a sort of superficial layer on top of longstanding structures, or are they embedding themselves and shifting some of these regions because of their control? The other thing that you proposed is that bronze coinage played an important role in the smooth functioning of local or regional economies. And I wanted to push you a little bit further on how the military and those local economies might interact. You've alluded to an argument that I think is undoubtedly correct, that the Seleucids don't seem to be particularly interested in monetizing their own empire. However, the flip side of that is they seem to monetize their empire through their choice to pay their soldiers almost exclusively in coinage, be that silver or bronze. And for soldiers to actually be able to utilize that coinage in micro-regional economic bits in Babylon, you're going to need the necessitation for those regions to be able to accept coinage. And does the imperial state need to force the acceptance on coinage in economies? And is that some of the things that you're seeing in the astronomical diaries of that interaction of the soldiers are being paid in coinage and they need to be able to expect to use it? And does the state play a role there? So one of my questions was, do we have a sense of how we bridge that gap between what the soldiers are being paid and what's being accepted in local marketplace that wind up as the end users of this coinage? And further, a bit connected to this, but admitting that the relative scarcity of the empire, does the increase in particular regions at particular times also emphasize the sort of pre-existing condition of an increase in a military population? I believe you sort of suggested this, that the Seleucids seem to be really interested in the late second, or sorry, well, throughout most of the 2nd century in Phoenicia and Syria, where they spend most of their time trying to kill each other. That it seems to coincide with that generation of municipal coinage. The final question that you've raised, and when I was reading this last night, I didn't ask myself, but as you talk through it again, is how municipal or how quasi-municipal is that municipal coinage? Is this not something that can function entirely within an imperial bit, but adopting that sort of local regional administrators and allowing them some greater flexibility in the expression of imperial authority, particularly if it's being minted at the same mints? It's probably still being distributed through the army in the first place, and it seems to be regionally based and at least occasionally moving across regions. Is that tendency to call it quasi-municipal that seems to have grown out of a desire to see this as a reflection of Seleucid collapse, a modern mirage rather than a changing of the relationship between imperial structures in one region for very particular historical reasons? I think I've probably asked a whole bunch of really, really big questions in that. But those were the major sort of questions that sprang out of accepting, I think, the entirely accurate conclusions that you come to on the basis of the evidence that you presented. So I'll turn you over and say thank you again to that. Mm-hmm.
Thanks very much. I'm sort of frantically trying to write all this down and think it through in my head, but thank you. I think you raised some really good points. I'll start at the end with this idea about the quasi-municipal coinages. I think you're completely 100% right to question what is actually quasi-municipal about them. What does that name actually mean? Which to me is completely unclear. And I think Oliver Hoover recently wrote a piece sort of questioning why we call them this and what does that mean, and should we be adopting a different model? And I think that's absolutely right. As you suggest, I think a lot of this sort of attempt at classification is tied to outdated modes of thinking, tied to the relationship and the dominance of cities, and this idea that coinage is related to autonomy in some kind of strange way, and tied to the idea of Seleukid collapse. I think what sort of holds me back is that I don't know what we would call them if we didn't call them quasi-municipal coinages. But I do think they fall very nicely into the sort of mode of thinking about imperial interaction that we see in John Ma's construction, for instance, of honorific decrees. It's difficult to decide if an honorific decree partakes of imperial or civic language because neither exists without the other. And I think these coinages partake of a similarly liminal space, and maybe rethinking how we classify them would open up a larger mode of rethinking how we classify imperial interaction in general. which is maybe a topic large enough for a dissertation, but probably slightly too large for this moment right now. To just kind of look back briefly on the rest of your really interesting comments. Sorry, I'm trying to read my very fast notes, which are never all that terribly legible. About the monetization of the empire and the role that soldiers play in this, as you said, as the sort of first users of coinage. We have the Seleukids very definitely paying their soldiers in bronze or in small silver coinage. And it does imply, right, that there is a market for this coinage. And this is something that I am attempting to explore in my dissertation chapter. What happens to the coinage after the soldiers receive it? It's going to someone, it's going to markets in towns and in cities and in maybe villages, in markets that spring up to service the soldiers. But what happens to it after that? Is it then immediately returning back to the cities in the form of purchasing power, in the form of taxation? Does it ever actually reach back into local producers? Are local sort of rural producers ever being paid with bronze coinage for the goods that they bring into the marketplace? Unfortunately, evidence is not on my side here at all. But I am trying to look at circulation patterns a little bit, although, as we all know, the archaeological record, particularly for bronze coinages, is a deeply frustrating nightmare. But I think logically we have to assume that at least some of this coinage is moving further out away from cities in a kind of ripple pattern out into rural communities. Okay, I think I'm going to leave it there. But thank you so much for your response. You've given me so much to think about, and I really appreciate it.
Thank you very much for the exchange of questions, answers, and views. Kai, it's still your privilege to ask back or give some further feedback or comments or continue the dialogue.
I'm going to add one, which is just a fun modern regional, and it'll be paper money, which is the circulation of Scottish notes more widely in Britain, which are, of course, legal tender, but not more widely accepted the further away you get from Scotland. And the same also applies in Northern Ireland, all of which are, of course, UK accepted banknotes, but is anybody else here British? who will notice, but actually it was one of the things that noted of the, oh, you've taken a Scottish £20 note and you've tried to spend it in London. No, we don't want to accept it. It's just, yes, you will. Okay, and they will, but it is one of those things that moves around of regional coinage that still exists in a relatively small bit. And I can see that functioning at least in modern Britain as well. Even as things are accepted, it just provokes more queries sometimes.
I think we have a similar situation on the sort of Canada-US border where you will sort of find yourself in dodgy circumstances of trying to figure out who's paying in which currency. And definitely, I think border spaces are slightly confusing when you get involved in this sort of exchange of money, and it's got all kinds of political business attached to it that makes things confusing. I think always ultimately practicality reigns for the exchange of money.
The useful one on the British example is it's not required to exchange because it is one currency. Mm-hmm. They just look different.
Right.
Since we are adding modern perspectives, I may chip in, well, one North American and one European example, looking from the dollar question from the northern perspective. Actually, it's no problem in Canada. We do accept US dollars just for the fact it's 20 to 30% worth more, and it's accepted as on equal footing. So no problem from the Canadian side. And back to the UK, just a comment from someone who is European in his heart. Had the UK joined the Eurozone some years ago, there wouldn't be that problem. So euros from all over the Eurozone are accepted anywhere in the Eurozone and far beyond, with no discrimination. On the contrary, it's even a big pleasure if you find a euro from a more remote or smaller country, and a lot of appreciation for that. But these are only footnotes. When it, I would now, although I do have many questions, I would now rather want to open the floor to all participants. So if you have questions, comments, or suggestions, please raise your hand rather digitally. And if I should not see you in time, you then just speak up. But who wants to go first?
I'll go.
Ben, please.
Okay, first of all, that was a wonderful presentation. I thank you for it. And also I thank Kyle. I have one very specific question, one sort of bigger question. Laodike, mother of Canaan, could you talk more about that? That to me is a very interesting phrase. But my bigger question is, let's go back to Antiochus IV. I have a very simple mind, so I sort of need a handle. When he was allowing those local coinages, was that out of strength? Was that out of weakness? Or was that out of political sophistication? Okay, so just to sort of explain what I mean, strength means I'm so cool, I'm so powerful, I can allow them to do these things and do their ideological expressions, as you put it, because I'm doing so well. You seem to imply, when I think you used the word light-handed, that he's sort of light-handed with those groups because he's worried about them, as he should have been, about whether they'll really stay. So wasn't that out of weakness allowing that? Or, and I'm thinking now about Kyle's paper about Zeus and Apollo that I'll never get over because I love it so much, where, if I understand Kyle correctly, he's saying this guy did Zeus here and Apollo there. He did what he needed to do to be popular, to give the people what they wanted. I hope I'm not simplifying what Kyle was saying. So if it's the same guy, so can I make a kind of parallel between what Kyle's saying about Zeus and Apollo? Okay, different regions will get different things, that's a mark of complexity, of political sophistication, right? Or is it just, oh, you know what, I'm gonna have to give in to these guys or else they're gonna revolt against me. So again, is it strength, is it weakness, or is it sophistication? And I don't know if Kyle would accept that analogy anyway.
That analogy? Yes, I would.
That, I think that is a difficult question to ask. And I think it's difficult because of the way that you pose the question, right? Which is obviously not a criticism. But we tend to think in terms of these binaries of strength and weakness. And I think that, you know, I like the idea of political sophistication, maybe a little bit more. The idea that allowing cultural, local expressions of identity or even of autonomy, that this must be an indication of political weakness, sort of giving concessions to local groups, is something that I don't necessarily agree with. I think you could equally read it as a show of strength, as not being concerned about expressions of autonomy. I think things are more complicated for the Seleucids, as I think they are more complicated in almost everything that relates to the Seleucids. When I say that they had a light touch, what I mean is that following conquest, it would not be an intelligent move to sort of move in with a heavy hand and start crushing down resistance. The Seleucids, especially in the Levant, show a very intelligent ability to co-opt local elites to their side, which I think is very integral to their ability to achieve and retain power there. So I think I would say an expression of political sophistication, but also a larger expression of a kind of power that is inherently flexible in plastic rather than wrapped up in binaries of strength and weakness. Although I think that that plasticity is both a strength and eventually probably a little bit of a downfall for the Seleukid later. But Kyle may have something more to add on that.
No, I'm sort
Sorry to
of.
put you on the spot.
My view is that the Seleucids were largely willing to attempt to syncretize things in a way that they were that light touch functioned, which is why I think I'm very in tune with your view that they are very light touch and attempting to create a view of empire that's just basically acceptable to whoever and is malleable in whatever way they might use it. I think the longer they're around, the more willing they are to assert an authority or to assert an identity. I think early in the empire, they're much more flexible. And I think later in the empire, they've established far more to what it means to be a Seleucid, which is interestingly when you see far more variety propping up later, but also at that time, they're all fighting with each other. So it's really hard. It's really distracting. And they need to assert that difference of identity. But I think you get that subsuming of local into imperial early, not necessarily in relation to how strong or weak they are, but just entirely of how, in an attempt to be malleable in places where they aren't, their authority extends fairly well when they're there with an army, but they're less, but how much of their authority is actually persistent? I think you've raised this, Ben, and I know Richard raised this as well. What does the Seleucid authority look like when they're not around? in those questions of resistance, and I think that that ability to absorb every symbol is sort of useful in that, particularly early.
I would have a couple of questions, some also drawing on the chat box. But first of all, I'm trying to come to grips with the many aspects that you have presented, and you are still juggling. And I very much appreciate your attempt at overcoming preconceived binaries, and you appreciate pragmatism of the Seleucids in general. But many of the things, or of the evidence that you have produced, much of the evidence, does it not support the view that initially, earlier in the 3rd century, bronze coinage was something largely introduced centrally and gradually also received by some local communities that were receptive to it after a process that we can only speculate about? And then we see actually an increase of these local mints, or say dual or collaborative mints that might still continue issuing royal and local coinage. So would you agree that this is the overall trajectory, and that most local bronze coin productions are actually the result of previously perhaps interacting with central or royal bronze coinage? Is that a correct way of interpreting what you have presented?
I think so. Yeah, I mean, I think that's one of the wonderful and confusing things about the Seleucids, right, is that influence really does go both ways. And I definitely think that the widespread use of coinage is taking influence from the Seleucids, who particularly in the early years of the empire and in the early sort of first couple of reigns are really pushing coinage, not just to pay for soldiers, but also as a means of constructing an ideological identity. And I do think that this is something that is already present in the cities of the west of the empire, where there's already a long tradition of a monetized economy. But I do think that those cities are engaging with Seleukid authority and learning from and adapting from the way that the Seleucids are presenting, particularly imperial ideology an expression of identity. I think it might be hard to say whether that's coming from the sort of center out or outwards into the center. It's a little bit of a chicken and an egg situation, possibly. But I do think you're correct in the large point that you're making.
If that is the case, then I think it's a little bit clearer than the chicken and egg dichotomy, because at least if I am developing this thought correctly, then a strong, of course, the initiative would have been by the royal mint, by the court, if you want, but then there would be a strong factor of choice among the communities. So there is now bronze coinage available, say by the migrating court, by soldiers, by military units that have these coinage. And would there then have been a high level of freedom saying at the local level, we accept this coinage, or you have to, or we don't accept this coinage? Because it's not necessarily defying or accepting royal authority, generally speaking, but as you've pointed out, you used the nice term fiduciary coinage. So it's a big step to accept bronze coinage, which is so overvalued, and to give grain or chicken out instead for these few tokens of bronze, which is something completely different as to trade something in for silver coinage. So what I'm trying to get at is there a very high level of autonomy even at the very beginning of the process, not at the end of the process when then there is this quasi-municipal coinage, but rather much earlier when it is about accepting the central royal coinage, and after a while then perhaps cooperating and reinforcing the royal initiative, and perhaps even benefiting economically. I like your idea that the major incentive of the cities to cooperate is the financial gain that they would have by issuing these coins. But if I'm here on the right track, I would find it very interesting that the notion of autonomy would already be in place at a very early stage. And that would link to the broader topic of autonomy of cities in the Seleukid kingdom. I think most cities were somehow autonomous, and even at a very high level autonomous from early on, because the king didn't have the means to control and regulate them. It's rather that we are finding more expressions of local identities later on, which then have very often been understood as expressions of autonomy. Despite the fact that we do see disintegration of royal authority in the context of dynastic wars. That is a different matter, but we cannot easily equate these developments. So I'm very much interested in your findings and your interpretation of the coin evidence, due to my interest in the political and dynastic developments.
Right. Well, this takes us back a little bit to this long-lasting idea of the freedom and autonomy of the Greek cities, right? The interaction with the polis, which is such a dominant idea in the idea of Seleukid interaction. As far as minting goes, unfortunately, there's not a lot of information about the minting process. And about how that's sort of administrated. I don't think we have a ton of evidence for how that's really controlled. We know a little bit about the structure of mints in the economic administration, but I'm not sure that we can definitively say how that plays into autonomy for the Greek cities. I definitely think that the construction of civic identities on these coinages points to a high level of autonomy. But it's difficult to really be sure about that without knowing how images are selected and approved for these coinages, which is something that I don't think we can necessarily know for sure. I mean, to me, it seems unlikely that there's a Seleukid administration running around checking every, left-facing prow image on a bronze coin, of which there are multiples. Maybe there were approved types. Maybe it was more of a sort of, let me put this out there and see if anybody comes knocking to yell at me kind of a situation. But it's really difficult to say from the evidence who's in charge of creating and choosing.
Yes. Well, I can add in this context one of the chat questions, the question by Alice, namely asking where did actually the bronze come from when there were so-called local issues? Was that delivered by the court, or did they have to organize it locally? Probably we do not even know. But what would be your guess then, or your suggestion?
Well, I'm very interested in methodological analysis of coinages, so I'd love to be able to answer that definitively. But my understanding is that the process is quite expensive and difficult and involves some sort of spaceship style machinery to really get into the metal analysis of coinage, which would let us examine the makeup of particular metals and orient them geographically. But I do think it's likely that there is a level of imperial oversights, mineral rights, the production of metals. These are normally something that falls under imperial control. And I think it's unlikely that too many cities are sort of going around just handling their own metal supplies and doing whatever they like with it. This seems like something that would fall under imperial jurisdiction to me.
Thank you for this. I also have another question by Susan Sims, and I tried to read it out. I have some difficulties here at my laptop. This was quite fascinating. The use for military purpose in a village or town usage has much credit. One must assume that those soldiers were garrisoned in the area. During times of war, those same soldiers may be gone, thereby reducing the economic value of the coins. So how would you comment this suggestion?
Yeah, I think, when you're dealing with an overvalued coinage like bronze coinage, where the valuation is dependent on civic approval, sort of, but also on approval of the marketplace, you do have to wonder what's happening to the value of a bronze coinage if you have suddenly a garrison appear and you have a market flooded with bronze coinages, and suddenly every purchase is being made in this fashion. How is this affecting the marketplace? And then what happens when a garrison leaves? I think it would depend a lot on how much of the coinage is staying in circulation after the disappearance of troops. But circulation patterns make it a little bit difficult to answer that definitively. Sorry, I feel like every answer I give is circulation patterns are unclear and it's really hard to know, but unfortunately that's largely the case.
Thank you so far.
If I might ask that.
Yeah, sure.
That was part of my question was, you have soldiers there and then they go to war or they leave and go to another village. You have all their money go with them, which would decrease the amount of actual coinage. They wouldn't leave the coinage there. So, but in the circulation, you don't see it out, like you said, you don't see it far away. It begs the question, where'd the money go?
Yes, I think that's very true. And I mean, part of the answer to that question might be tied up in the fact that bronze coinages are very difficult to recover from archaeological remains. And when they are recovered, they're often not cataloged properly or at all. So it's a little bit difficult to address that. But That's something I'm very interested in. What happens to money once it leaves the soldier's pocket? But it's also important, I think, to consider here that bronze coinage is usually used, we think, for provision pay. So for sort of daily per diem, get your sort of daily needs pay. And then there's also a sort of larger payment that would be made at the end of a campaign, say, which is likely to have paid in silver. And that would have also impacted, I think, the value and the presence of bronze coinage as well. So there's a lot of threads to be untangled in that question. It's a very good question. Thank you.
Thank you. Great.
Now,
Great,
Nicholas?
great talk.
I was just thinking the same astronomical diary you refer to actually answers that question, because some 4 to 6 months later, there's a large economic crisis with a tale of people selling their own children to be able to buy food. So that's of course also the Babylonians not using bronze coinage beforehand, but I mean, it's
Yes.
likely, yeah. Once the soldiers
I
disappear, there's a crisis.
think you're very right that the diaries do show us the sort of terrible effects that happen to populations when you have this influx of soldiers and cash, and then suddenly they're gone. What happens to the price structures? What happens to people? I mean, we've all just lived through the basically collapse of the global economy. Sorry to be depressing. But what happens to people who are then trying to build up their lives in the wake of this? I do think you're very right to point to this kind of dire picture in the astronomical diaries, although I always do sort of want to push back a little bit and be like, how much are the diaries deliberately painting a picture that is slightly, I don't know, maybe not anti-Seleukid, but a little bit.
I would say not so much in the early period, because
That's
at
fair.
that point there's still an awful lot of Hietism. So, I mean, you have the Antiochos cylinder and other texts. I think only later they start to get a bit more complicated.
Yes, but I do think that there's always a little bit of a complex cultural interaction between temple administration and the diaries and the Seleukid Empire. But I do agree with what you're saying, definitely.
Have you read the literature on the late Babylonian priestly literature? Because if you're interested in that, it would be very interesting.
I have not actually. Would you mind
Michael,
typing that?
okay.
Because I
No problem.
added the languages. Thank you.
My pleasure.
In the meantime, while I'm inviting further questions, I'd like to actually come back to the Babylonian example. Well, you rightly said, Deirdre, that there is a high complexity involved, whether it's the diaries or the question of what happened with coinage specifically or with the market structure. But then you expressed your view that the Babylonians were actually anti-Seleukid, at least a little bit. Since I've just written a chapter trying to show how strongly how positive the long-term relation between the Seleukids and the Babylonians were, I'd like to, well, follow up on this dialogue. And what did actually the withdrawal of the royal residents from Babylon to Seleucia on the Tigris mean? And with that, and I only learned from your paper that it also meant the withdrawal of bronze coinage, and potentially with that even a demonetization. What does it mean? Is that something that was only perceived or necessarily perceived as negative, or may there not also have been many positive aspects? Perhaps a return to a market that had been more stable, perhaps the avoidance of coinage that brought images of foreign divinities into a very traditional city. So yeah, I see many possible aspects to it. What would be your take on this?
Well, I think the relationship between Seleukid and the Tigris and Babylon is a very complicated one, obviously. I tend to think that the two cities are more integrated than we see from a sort of cursory reading of the source material. This idea that we have, the Seleukids coming in and taking the population, and the money, and going off somewhere else and building their own city, I think needs to be tempered a little bit. I think there would have still been a high degree of monetary exchange, as well as sort of social and cultural engagement between the two cities. But clearly there's a level of resentment going on the part of the Babylonian population. But we do know that Babylon remains a very vibrant city throughout the Seleukid period. I mean, there's no evidence to back up these ideas we find in the Greek sources that sort of Babylon becomes this ghost city and everybody's gone and it's left to rot. I mean, there's no sort of actual archaeological evidence to back that up. And there's certainly, we can see from the textual evidence from the Near East itself that there is still a very vibrant economy happening. And I think it's likely that with the moving of bronze coinage to Seleucia, it's intended to bolster its economic status, give it some profit. And maybe it was felt that Babylon didn't need that profit or just wasn't going to get it. But I think I advocate for a fairly well integrated regional economic network between the two. I hope that answers your question. I feel like I wandered away a little bit.
Well, yeah, that does make sense, and that would actually defy any radical position such as of hostility, or perhaps overestimating the effect, either a negative or a positive effect of the departure of the royal residence. So that clearly makes sense to me, and it would be very difficult to imagine how these two major cities would not have interacted economically and culturally very closely. So thank you for that. We might still take one question if there is, but you have to be quick. Yes, Ben, please.
Okay, I'd asked before about Laodike, mother of Canaan, and because I asked another question, we got sidetracked.
Sorry.
I want to still ask you about that, and I want to tell you why I'm being so persistent in asking. To me, what that symbolizes is a Seleukid control, mother of Canaan, the ancient things. It would be going in the opposite direction symbolically from what we've been thinking about. I don't know if I'm saying this clearly, right? In other words, it's opposed to these ancient, and you're quite right, and not everybody does this, about separating those cities that had history and memory from newer cities. I mean, I just recently read an article where the person wasn't making that differentiation. I think you did that very well. So, but Canaan, I mean, you can't get more ancient than that. And to put a Seleukid, to say that she's the mother, isn't that a kind of Seleukid superimposition onto the ancients?
I see what you mean. I mean, I think here this claim to be the sort of metropolis, I don't know that I would consider that to be an expression embedded deeply in a Seleukid consciousness. To me, these claims to be mother or metropolis, these are really embedded in the civic relationship between these cities, which, as you say, is long and storied and embodies a really deep cultural memory that the Seleukids do not touch. In a sense, they are newcomers in a way that I doubt they could have even really appreciated, and I'm not sure that we can really appreciate what that means today. Again, I feel like I keep coming back to, these are complicated expressions of identity, but to me, these statements are directed regionally and not imperially. Do they fall under the aegis of Seleukid control? Yes, but I think we have to ask ourselves how much the Phoenician cities were really concerning themselves with that. This is a region that's seen a lot of empires come and go. To what extent? I mean, fine, put your little anchor or put your little kingship symbols on the coins, fine. We endure. But I feel like you probably, Ben, have a better conception of what's going on in the region in that sense than I do.
But I guess I'm just asking, who would do that? Who would put a Seleukid queen name as mother of Canaan? That's
I
not
see.
a kind of imperialistic push in the other direction, not towards autonomy,
Got
but
it.
towards, we are now even over your memories. I mean, Canaan is a
Right.
really ancient name.
Yeah, no, I see what you mean. The use of a dynastic name is a really embedding of a Seleukid identity into this larger regional identity.
But I understand what you mean, that only a local person would even get that. So, would even get the meaning of that.
But I think also it may be a symbol of cities, sort of a city like Laodicea having to kind of hedge their bets a little bit. Can they engage in this kind of intercity rivalry? Sure, the Seleucids don't care. If they start reverting back to pre-dynastic names, that might be a little bit more of an explicit expression of autonomy that is possibly less likely to slide with the Seleukid authority, if that makes sense.
Okay, thank you.
Well, I think it is time finally to release Deirdre from her excellent performance today. If we were sitting in a room, we would all be clapping our hands very loudly, not only thanking her for this inspiring talk and the informed discussion, but also wishing her best of luck for the conclusion of her PhD, which is upcoming very soon. And we can do that with a lot of confidence that this will be a great success, and also the seminary for much further research on Seleukid ideology and the economy and where they interact. So this is really a very promising path of research. Now, having reached the end of our session today, I'd like to send out two further messages. First of all, everyone who's still in the recording or who has participated beforehand, whoever is working on the Seleucids and is doing some original research in whatever context, is very welcome to contact Ben or me and get in touch and offer a spot in our lecture series. We try to be very open and inclusive, and we are just pulling together the events for next year. We already have a high number of volunteers, but depending on who else would like to contribute, we might even come back to shared sessions. So please don't hesitate to get in touch. Last but not least, I'd like to advertise our upcoming lecture by Professor Panos Yosif next Seleukid Wednesday on the 19th of October, the same time and space. However, that time it will be a jointly organized event together with the conference of the Nancy Seleukid Study Group, which I mentioned earlier at the beginning of our session. You have the details in the chat box, but I will also send out a reminder email so that you can all register for the Zoom link in good time. So I hope to see, the title of the lecture, lest I forget that, will be Monetary Crisis equals Military Crisis and vice versa, with a question mark. So a methodological approach, which will be a wonderful follow-up to this highly methodological approach to numismatic issues. Before I end the session, Kyle has a question or a comment, an announcement, please, Kyle.
My question was, you don't seem to have put the links in the chat.
Did I not put it in?
I can't see it.
At the very beginning?
The very beginning of the chat box. Go all the way up.
I've gone all the way up, but I can't see it. So it might just be me.
Okay.
But I'm wondering if it's anybody else besides me.
I don't see it either.
Okay, good.
You don't see it either?
I see it from 10:54 a.m.
But we were not yet there. That's why.
You know what? Well, you know what? I copy paste it in once more. Give me a sec. and we'll stay. You can then stay a little longer in the Zoom meeting, but I do think it is the right time now to end the recording, Ben.